the heart of the pagan wood. 16 years ago. Victoria's ink-black mane billowed wildly in the frigid air. A change was coming. She could feel it. All around her, the forest was dying. She could hear the plants and animals scream as the toxins of the city found and claimed them one by one. Her green eyes narrowed and began to gleam a hellish red. Karas. She had never wanted to impale a man full with her branches more than she did at that very moment. And very soon, she would get her chance. The nymph glanced over her shoulder into a nest of leaves and soft moss. There lay the slumbering form of a tiny, ruby-haired toddler. Although she was no older than 2, Victoria knew full well that she was far from helpless. Casting her eyes up to meet the ivory moon, the wood nymph shuddered. She needed to make this alliance work, even if it ended up killing her. She still despised Garrett for what he had done. Humans and their pitiful vengeance. The way they would throw their lives to the wind for the sake of preserving their hollow and corrupt world. He was coming soon. Some of her scouts had spotted him tailing someone into the woods. One of those foul mechanists, no doubt. Victoria looked to her right, where the disemboweled remains of the last intruders lay strewn. More would surely come. From the confines of her bed of leaves and flowers, the child began to stir. She sat with a tiny yawn, causing her mother to smile. The child's eyes flashed in a blaze of yellow and green swirls. She opened her mouth and addressed her beloved parent in a forgotten tongue. The wood nymph smiled and nodded. Giving a slight giggle, the little creature clambered out of her bed and raced away into the surrounding foliage. Victoria watched her play, a single shred of emotion gripping at her heart. Yes, for the sake of her forest, the sake of the future of her only child. She had to make this work.
Diane, come forth.
Victoria spoke in human tongue this time. From beyond the shadows of a weeping willow tree, a dark-skinned woman emerged. She bowed graciously before the nymph.
You calls, my woodsy lady.
Victoria loomed over her submissive form, towering over the little human, her eyes dark and brooding. Her skin transformed from a verdant green to a hard and ligneous bark.
Has he entered our territory?
The thief sees. Yes, he bees here.
The wood nymph's elegant face contorted into a malicious, yet adamant grin.
Good. Then let us go and formally greet our new partner.
The city. Present day.
Garrett, you're brooding again.
Guinevere smiled, brushing away a strand of ruby hair from her eyes.
Why do you do that so often?
I've never really given it much thought, Guinevere.
Oh, okay.
She stood up and stretched her long legs. Garrett watched as she skipped across the floor before practically throwing herself to her knees before Pilfer.
Hi, kitty.
She cooed. Her random childish actions nearly caused the thief to chuckle. She was so innocent and placid around him, around Pilfer. And yet, she had the power to horrifically end any and all who posed a threat to anything or anyone she held dear. He averted his gaze back towards the clock tower window. Garrett wondered if she indeed even knew of the burden she had inadvertently placed upon his weary shoulders. Of how the Baron and the City Watch now blamed him for the murder of the thief-taker general. He wouldn't be safe within his clock tower forever. But for the moment, he remained. Garrett had nowhere else to go. Nowhere else left to hide. The Rat King, as the nefarious general used to call him, was running out of shadows. And that was something that Garrett wasn't all too familiar with. Something that he wasn't prepared for.
Meow.
Guinevere's voice echoed slightly through the hollow dankness of the tower. The thief looked down the stairs at her, crooking an eyebrow. The girl was still kneeling in front of Pilfer, but now she had her face just above his, and was making feline impressions for the kitten. Strangely, the cat would imitate the sound, almost replying to her impersonation of him. Guinevere would merely repeat the sound, with varying pitches and extensions. Then, Pilfer would do the same. Garrett must have watched the odd conversation for a good 5 minutes before clearing his throat. Guinevere looked up at him through wide eyes.
Guinevere? What are you doing?
Her response was not even close to anything he had expected her to say.
Garrett, why didn't you tell me?
Tell you what exactly?
That they were after you. They think you killed that bad man. But it was me.
Her eyes shuddered with emotion, and Guinevere fought hard to keep the tears from coming.
You didn't kill him, Garrett. It was me. It was all me. They can't do this to you. They can't do this.
Garrett stomped down the steps to the bend in the stairway where his lover and apprentice now stood. In an attempt to calm her, he cupped his thin fingers around her upper arms and shook her once.
Guinevere, calm down.
Her mouth still agape, Guinevere ceased her hysterics, and allowed the tears to leave her eyes instead. The thief withdrew his right hand from her, and gently clasped her cheek. He began to stroke it gingerly, causing her to gasp from his touch. Even with his rough digits and thick leather gloves, his caress was still warm and soft. A stream of salty tears glided over his middle finger as he stroked. The thief smiled.
That's not quite what I had in mind, Guinevere.
He offered, pulling her head into his awaiting chest. Guinevere let loose, weeping bitterly as she trembled against the slick leather. Garrett ran his hands over her soft red locks, his eyes locked on an unseeable void directly in front of him, and his mind lost in thought. Although he did not show it, he was genuinely concerned over what fates would befall him, should he be captured. And while Garrett hadn't initially believed this even a remote possibility, he now realized the inevitable. Muffled by the leather, Guinevere's weepy voice stammered.
Garrett, let me take the blame for this. Let me turn myself in. I don't care what they do to me. It will be worth it to save you.
Garrett's eyes widened, and his mouth formed a simple smile. Guinevere's selfless nobility never ceased to amaze him. Gently prying her free from his chest, he wiped away the last of her tears, and squatted to bring himself to her level. The thief locked eyes with her, and craned his head to the side a little, examining her distraught expression. Her face was a cluster of fear, guilt, and deep sorrow. She refused to meet his stares. Instead, her forlorn green eyes remained locked upon the dirty wooden floor.
Guinevere.
Garrett beckoned. She still refused to meet his gaze. The thief grinned with challenge, and tried again.
Can you look at me, please?
Slowly and reluctantly, the little nymph did as she was asked, although her head was still off to the side.
Yes?
She whispered.
What did I tell you about that man? He deserved what he got. You killed him to save my life. You did the right thing, Guinevere.
Not if it gets you killed! Oh, Garrett, do you even know what the Baron does to those who murder public officials?
Her pupils dilated in terror.
From that look you're giving me, I have a pretty good idea it's worse than being hung.
The thief scoffed dryly.
Garrett, this is no time for jokes!
I wasn't joking. It sounds pretty rough.
He grinned again. Guinevere was far from amused.
Please, just let me save you.
Your intentions are good, but remember, Guinevere, there is no honor among thieves.
He offered.
So the old saying goes.
She wiped her eyes.
But thanks to you, I now know that's not true.
Garrett was touched by her words, but he still wasn't about to let her turn herself in. Guinevere was stubborn, but not as stubborn as he.
Guinevere, who told you about the allegations?
The nymph smiled and pointed to where Pilfer was laying in the moonlight, a dead rat pinned beneath his velvety paws. The thief shot her a worried look.
Are you trying to tell me that the cat told you?
Uh-huh. Cats know more than most animals, Garrett. They really get around.
She nodded.
I see.
Garrett murmured, beginning to worry about her.
Well, the trick is getting them to spill their secrets. They can be a bit exclusive. You have to earn their trust. But then again, that's true with any animal. In fact...
The thief cut her short by positioning his index finger over her full lips.
Breathe, Guinevere, just for a moment.
When he was sure that she wouldn't try to speak again, he continued.
So, you can talk to animals too?
Of course. All nymphs can do that.
And Pilfer told you about this?
Yes.
Guinevere, Pilfer never leaves the clock tower, even if I...
He stopped himself, not wishing to offend her by stating that he did not believe her.
The point being, how could he possibly know?
A little birdie told him. Well, before he ate it, of course.
Guinevere cocked her head to the side with a giggle. The thief rubbed his temples with a groan.
Of course.
He looked down at his Guinevere again. The little nymph's eyes were positively dancing with starlight and a radiant luster of peace.
Guinevere, what's done is done. Don't trouble yourself over such things.
But Garrett!
She began. The wily thief leaned into her gaping lips and consumed her into a deep, comforting kiss. When he pulled back, Garrett gripped both of her tiny hands in his, ivory moonlight illuminating their joined silhouette.
Everything will be all right. I promise you this.
Guinevere poked at her last slice of bread. She was still slightly underweight from the hazardous week that she had spent alone, but the morsel was unwanted this evening. Her worries and tension did more than a satisfactory job at filling her yearning stomach with dozens of uncomfortable knots. She watched Garrett devour his dinner, and blatantly pushed her plate towards him.
Here, you seem pretty hungry tonight.
She muttered softly, turning away from him. Garrett swallowed the moistened bite of bread within his mouth and stared at her. The thief's brows lowered slightly in concern.
Guinevere? What's going on?
He asked, his concern growing. It was unlike the usually bubbly girl to be so silent, and he knew that she was bound to be starving. The twosome hadn't eaten in days. Barso had sent word via his new magpie that the City Watch had become obsessed with finding the infamous thief, more than they ever had for any criminal before. The boxman was sure that it was due to the thief-taker general's murder, and he strongly, almost threateningly, advised Garrett to remain within the confines of his tower. Guinevere had only recently managed to sneak out long enough to procure the 2 loaves of bread and cheap wine that they were devouring now.
Nothing!
She defended, her green eyes distraught and unsure. Garrett frowned, and pushed his plate to the corner of the makeshift table, which in actuality was nothing more than an old splintered crate.
You're a terrible liar, Guinevere. You always have been.
His lips curled into a warm smile.
Now I know that something is upsetting you. I need you to trust your teacher.
The young woman looked up at him with desperate eyes, her face forlorn and distant. She swallowed hard.
It's just... I've been doing a lot of thinking lately.
She faced her thief, and locked her eyes into his.
About my past. More specifically about my mother.
Garrett winced at the mention of Victoria. It seemed that every time Guinevere mentioned her, his right eye burned with agony, and his heart ached with bitter loss. Bravely, the thief straightened his posture and did his best to take the upcoming conversation in stride. Although it burdened him terribly to be reminded of such graphic unpleasantries, at least he could remember. Guinevere, for the life of her, could not recall even the slightest detail of her past. Good or bad. Garrett wasn't sure if such a handicap was a blessing or a curse, but if she truly wanted answers, he wasn't about to deny her information which was rightfully hers.
What about her?
He asked, nearly regretting the question as the final syllable left his tongue. The little nymph faced him, as pale as death.
I don't recall much about her. Other than she really loved me. She used to call me by a name that I can no longer speak. The nymph dialect has become all but lost to me.
She was very still, looking downward at her crumb-covered plate.
Before I encountered the Temple Keeper, I had forgotten about my previous life within the woods, save her. But now...
Guinevere shakily spoke.
Are you alright, Guinevere?
The thief asked, with growing concern.
Who am I, Garrett?
She shrieked.
I know that Guinevere isn't my true identity, my true name, but I can't for the life of me pronounce the title she gave me.
She stared at him for a second, then swallowed the uncomfortable tightness in her throat.
The only thing I had left in this world to remember that life by was a wooden locket that she gave me a week before she died. But
She shook, her face contorting with a deep and inconsolable loss. Garrett sat up straight. Ever since the temple keeper had told him of Guinevere's roots, of her past, of her heritage. Ever since the night he had almost lost her, the thief suspected that this discussion would surface. He had thought at the time that when it did, he would be prepared for it. He was very wrong.
What happened to it?
my father...
Guinevere corrected herself, shaking away the last of the devotion she had kept all those years for Simmons.
Lord Simmons. He destroyed it.
Garrett looked up, feeling for the trembling creature before him.
I see.
He pondered this, feeling even more scorn for the prominent figurehead than usual.
Garrett, if I became a goddess, would I become like my real father? Would I...
Tears began to form within their green glass prison.
have to hurt people?
Suddenly, Garrett did not want to talk to her anymore. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also had no desire to confirm her greatest of fears, that the blood of a demonic forest god ran through her veins, that such things as blood sacrifices and causing non-believers harm and death was mandatory.
I thought you said before that you didn't want to become a goddess, Guinevere.
He countered.
I don't!
She screamed, startling him.
Why do you think I shattered the Woodsy Emerald? Why do you think I turned my back on the pagans? On the forest? But even so...
She collapsed into a defeated heap, looking as though she were about to break apart.
Guinevere?
Garrett began, worriedly. Guinevere refused to speak to him, now faced with the horrible truth about what her future inevitably held for her. What the last mother ritual would do. She loved Garrett. He was her teacher, her first and only love, her savior. She would never forget all that he had done for her, the blood that he had shed to preserve her very life. But as she sat there on the cold floor, Guinevere determined that she was no longer worthy of such a gift. Through eyes glassy and wide, she glanced up at her concerned mentor. She wondered what was going through his head. Was he thinking the same thing? However, her assumptions couldn't have been further from the truth. Before she realized what was happening, the thief leaned in and kissed her lightly, as the tears continued to fall from her green eyes.
Guinevere.
His hand met hers.
I'm... sorry.
For what, Garrett?
Guinevere's eyes lit up with surprise. She was absolutely speechless. Why could he possibly be apologizing? She was the reason why the Watch now sought him out for a murder that he hadn't committed. She was the abomination with the mother whom had blinded him. Before she could protest, the thief continued.
For everything you've gone through, everything you've lost. You never wanted any of this, and yet, here you are. Life makes unfair demands of us all, Guinevere, but sometimes...
He lifted his head up and stared into the empty hollowness of the vaulted ceiling.
Sometimes life can be an absolute bitch. Sometimes she thinks it hilarious to give us more than we can possibly handle. Such is the case with you, Guinevere.
Garrett replied sorrowfully.
Garrett, please don't fret over me. My life is my own, as is my burden. I don't want you to think about it.
And what if I choose to? What do you intend to do about it?
Garrett interrupted slyly, his eyes twinkling in the candlelight. With that, he drew her into a long, heated kiss, sliding his tongue into Guinevere's mouth. When their lips parted, the thief stood, bringing her up with him, his body afire with Guinevere's presence. She gasped as he lifted her off her feet. Garrett set her gently upon the window ledge, leaning her slightly outwards. Guinevere gasped, her eyes flooding with deep terror.
Garrett, what are you doing?
She protested through the wind and icy rain. The thief's eyes were laced with meaningful intent and genuine promise. He leaned down towards her face, the nymph interlocked within his passionate grasp.
Do you trust me, Guinevere?
His hot breath ignited against her ear. Guinevere began to relax as she felt his body looming above hers, his powerful arms holding on to her as if for dear life.
Yes.
She whispered.
Yes, Garrett. I trust you.
Upon hearing her statement, the thief picked her up again, her long hair glinting with sparkles of rain and moonlight.
Good. I want you to know that I will never forsake you, nor will I turn on you, Guinevere.
He squeezed his eyes shut. A confession of love was still beyond him. Instead, he squeezed her drenched body tighter to his. Their tongues intertwined for a few wonderful moments, until the thief pulled away, leaving his protégée breathless. Leaving her atop the bed this time, Garrett threw off his cloak, and worked on undoing the many straps on his leather outfit. Guinevere began to unlace the dark navy ribbons of her corset, watching as it crumpled to the ground. She gasped as Garrett returned to her, the hotness of his skin setting her own ablaze, and their lips reunited once more.
I'll always trust you, Garrett. And I'll always love you, no matter what they end up doing to me.
Guinevere smirked slightly as she traced her slender fingers around Garrett's defined chest. The thief heard her soft giggles and decided to inquire.
I'm not that out of shape, am I?
He mused.
No, far from it.
She shrieked, not catching the hint of sarcasm in his voice. Garrett just chuckled at her naivety, soothing any and all of her worries into a comforting zest.
Garrett?
Yes, Guinevere?
I've been meaning to ask you, how have I been doing in this regard?
What regard would that be?
You know, learning to love you. Am I getting good at it?
She asked. Garrett looked down at where the young woman was reclining upon his chest and blinked, taken aback by this question. Did she think?
This isn't something I'm testing you on, Guinevere. This isn't about that.
He explained.
I know, I just wanted to make sure you like it.
She replied, her voice sultry, yet still very coy. Garrett scoffed.
Believe me, Guinevere, you have absolutely nothing to worry about in that regard.
Guinevere smiled, laying her head against his sweaty chest, feeling as it rose and fell, listening to his rapidly pulsing heart.
Garrett?
Yeah?
He asked, closing his eyes.
Who taught you how to do this?
The question caused the thief's eyes to fly open, and he instantly sat up.
Why are you asking me this?
I was just curious because you taught me.
She smiled.
I want to know who taught you.
Garrett looked up into the empty rafters. It had been a very long time since he had reflected that far back on his life, and the woman who had taken his virginity was so obscured within his memory now that the thief had almost forgotten her name.
Her name was Clarissa. We apprenticed under the keepers together.
Did you love her?
Only physically. I was very young, and I didn't think much about such things back then. To be quite honest, I've rarely given love any thought.
He continued to stare into the rafters, lost in thought.
Have you ever been in love?
Yes.
With who?
Garrett smiled knowingly as he looked down into her innocent face, his hawk eyes absorbing the lost luster of the distant meadows within. The pagan forest was a part of her still. Even if she chose to abandon it, it lived within her. This caused the thief to begin to ponder if more than just her forest would be lost, should she revoke her godlike power for him. This new train of thought made him feel very uneasy.